The slam echoed like gunfire. The enforcer's hand crushed the car door into my wife's stomach, and her scream carved straight through me. She folded in my arms, her 8-month belly clutched tight, the sound of metal still vibrating in my ears. Yet, the board president didn't flinch. She stood there in her vibrant suit, eyes narrowed, lips curved in that cold smile. "Trespassers learn fast," she spat, as if my wife's agony was proof of her power. "They called me a problem neighbor. They said I stirred up trouble at board meetings. But here's the contradiction they never saw. I build safety into the bones of cities, skyscrapers, bridges, systems that can't fail. And as the woman I loved gasped for air against me, I saw the fracture line in Patricia's empire. If you've ever seen a ruler walk into a trap of their own making, hit subscribe, because she's walking into a noose she can't slip from. My name's Michael Torres. I'm an engineer, a husband, a father-to-be. And standing there with her nails digging into my wrist, I wasn't thinking about bylaws or fines. I was thinking about survival. The HOA queen thought her board was untouchable, but she forgot. Authority can be revoked, especially when it's abused. Behind us, the oak tree loomed, the same tree where my wife first whispered the word heartbeat. The same roots we'd sat beneath when we chose our daughter's name. To Patricia, it was a restricted area. To us, it was a promise carved into bark and soil. When her muscle weaponized that door, he didn't just bruise my wife. He tried to sever a future we had planted under that tree. Her breath came ragged, shallow bursts that rattled through my chest as if they were my own. I lowered us both to the damp grass, the blade sticking to my palms. I could smell oil on the hinge, metallic and sour, mixed with the chlorine wafting from the pool nearby. Her eyes widened, pupils blown with terror, and I knew this wasn't about a parking violation. This was about whether our child would live to see daylight. Phones lifted, residents froze between filming and looking away. No one stepped in, not even Thomas Reed. He stood across the lot, a retired firefighter whose body had walked through smoke and flames. His jaw was tight, his fists twitched, but intimidation anchored his feet. That's what Patricia had built here. Not a community, but a cage. But here's the reversal. I don't bend, I don't freeze. Pressure sharpens me. I've spent years spotting weak joints and cutting corners before they collapse. And right then, I spotted hers. The thug wasn't licensed. He had no legal authority to touch anyone, let alone assault my wife. Patricia's empire was a facade, one inspection away from crumbling. Her lips trembled near my ear. "Don't let them win." Her voice was broken glass, but her grip was steel. I pressed my forehead against hers and whispered, "Never." But inside, it was more than a promise. It was a vow. The tyrant in heels clicked away as she turned to the crowd, her voice sharp enough to slice skin. "Let this be a lesson," she barked. "The board's rules are not optional." She wanted silence, intimidation, submission. No. This is what happens when you shove the wrong man too far. I lifted my head, locking eyes with the residents, with the cameras, with anyone who thought this was just another HOA squabble. The oak tree towered above, silent but watching, its branches heavy with the weight of memory. And I swore in that moment, this wouldn't end with fines or warnings. It would end with handcuffs. Because from where I was, kneeling in the grass, my wife trembling against me, it felt like the ground itself had taken sides. And I knew one thing. This fight wasn't going to stop at the guard. It was going straight to the top. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and I climbed in beside the mother of my child, gripping her hand as the siren wailed. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, and every flicker of pain across her features felt like a knife dragging across my skin. The hired thug's strike wasn't just reckless. It was violence dressed up as enforcement. And the HOA president had stood there, smirking, as though my wife's agony was nothing more than proof of her control. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and merciless. Nurses moved quickly, voices hushed but urgent, as they wheeled her through the double doors. I followed until they cut me off, telling me to wait. Wait. As if time wasn't a blade pressed against my throat. I dropped into one of the plastic chairs in the waiting room, my fists clenched so tight my nails dug half-moons into my palms. This wasn't the first strike the tyrant in heels had aimed at us. First, it was unauthorized flowers she planted by the walkway. Then, a bogus, excessive noise complaint during a barbecue. And finally, the parking violation under the oak tree. Each step wasn't about order. It was about humiliation. Patricia wanted us to kneel. She wanted the community to see what happened when you resisted her decrees. But I don't kneel. Not to her, not to anyone. A doctor came out, his face professional but edged with concern. She's stable, for now, but the stress caused early contractions. We'll monitor closely. His words hung heavy in the air, like steel beams creaking under too much weight. My chest tightened. My wife was fighting for calm in there, and Patricia thought she was winning out here. I pressed my hands to my face, then dropped them with a bitter laugh. Patricia had underestimated the stakes. This wasn't just about fines or bylaws. This was about the mother of my child, my future. And if she thought her smirk could erase that, she'd made the worst miscalculation of her life. The automatic doors hissed open, and I spotted Thomas Reed at the edge of the waiting room. His posture was stiff, his shoulders squared, but his eyes betrayed unease. He lingered like a man caught between two fires. Finally, he walked closer, lowering his voice. "I saw it," he said. Just 3 words, but they hit harder than any gavel Patricia had ever swung. I leaned forward, ready to grip his arm, to thank him, but his jaw clenched and he shook his head. "Don't ask me to testify. You know what she'll do to me if I stand up." His fists tightened at his sides. "She'll bury me in violations. She'll make my wife's life hell." He looked down, shame flickering across his face, then turned and walked out. I sat back, exhaling hard. Even a firefighter who had run through burning buildings was paralyzed by Patricia's reach. That's the kind of dread she had cultivated, thick enough to strangle courage. But dread doesn't last forever, not when someone is willing to break the silence. Hours dragged. I paced the sterile hallway, every step echoing like a countdown. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, bile rose in my throat. Another violation notice from the HOA, this time for improper trash disposal. My wife was lying in a hospital bed, and Patricia was still firing off fines. She wasn't just cruel, she was deliberate. A tyrant with a clipboard, drunk on authority. I stepped outside, the night air sharp in my lungs, the skyline lit with 1,000 windows. My reflection in the glass door looked like a stranger, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight, fury humming under my skin. Patricia thought she had the script written, fines, liens, silence. But she forgot one truth about me. I don't crumble, I build, and I rebuild stronger. I didn't sleep that night. My wife dozed in the hospital bed, machines beeping a steady rhythm. But my mind was wide awake, replaying every detail of that parking lot. The slam, the scream, the tyrant in heels smirking as if she'd orchestrated the whole thing. By morning, the weight of it pressed against my ribs like a steel beam threatening to crack. When the nurse finally told me she was stable, I stepped outside, desperate for air. The hospital courtyard was quiet, just a few smokers huddled by the edge. That's where I saw him, Thomas Reed, sitting on a bench, shoulders hunched forward, elbows digging into his knees. His firefighter frame looked smaller somehow, like the weight of silence was breaking him more than flames ever had. I approached slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the ground, jaw working side to side, as if he was chewing on words he couldn't swallow. His hands twisted together, knuckles white, the kind of grip a man uses when he's holding back more than just nerves. "Thomas," I said quietly. He flinched at his own name, then dragged his gaze upward. The look in his eyes told me everything. He'd seen it all, but dread had welded his tongue shut. His knee bounced restlessly. He tried to speak, lips parting, but only a low grunt escaped. He leaned back, dragged a hand down his face, then let out a shaky breath. His body screamed the war he was fighting inside. A man built to save lives, now paralyzed by the shadow of Patricia. I sat down beside him, not too close. His fist tapped against his thighs in an uneven rhythm. I shouldn't even," he muttered, stopping himself mid-sentence. His eyes flicked left and right, scanning for anyone watching. When he finally met my stare, his pupils darted away as if even eye contact was dangerous. "She owns everything here," he said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. "Not the land, not legally, but the people, the board, the intimidation. You stand up, you get crushed. I've seen it." His leg bounced harder, the bench shaking under the tension. "I've seen what she does." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees, matching his stance. "You also saw what she let happen last night." His throat worked as he swallowed. His gaze dropped again to the gravel. He rubbed his palms together, as if trying to scrub away the memory. His shoulders jerked like he wanted to argue, but no words came. Finally, he whispered, "I heard her. After." His chest rose and fell sharply. "She told that guard, 'Good, now they'll know their place.'" My jaw tightened. The words cut deeper than any slam of a car door. Patricia hadn't just allowed the assault. She celebrated it. Thomas's hands trembled as he pressed them against his knees. "I should have stepped in. I should have—" His voice cracked, and he shook his head violently, like he could throw the shame off his shoulders. His eyes glistened, but he blinked it back. "But if I speak up now, she'll bury me. My wife, she's already scared enough. I can't—" He stopped, clamping his teeth together so hard I heard them click. I wanted to grab his shoulders, to shake the truth out of him, but I held back. The man was already carrying a fire inside, one that hadn't found oxygen yet. His silence wasn't cowardice, it was survival. But survival can only last so long before guilt chokes it. He stood abruptly, running both hands over his head, pacing in front of the bench. His movements were jerky, restless, as though the air itself was a cage. Every step was an argument with himself. Every turn of his heel was another retreat from courage. He stopped, looked at me, lips pressed tight, then turned his back. "Thomas," I said again. His shoulders stiffened. He didn't move for a long moment. When he finally did, it was only to say, "I can't, not yet." His voice cracked on the last two words, and he walked away, hands shoved deep into his pockets, head bowed low. I sat there, watching his figure shrink down the pathway, every step heavier than the last. The man was drowning in guilt, but intimidation had its boot on his chest. He'd seen the truth, heard Patricia's cruelty firsthand. But chains aren't always made of metal. Sometimes they're fines, liens, threats, and Patricia had mastered invisible shackles. But I knew something Thomas hadn't admitted yet. A man who carries guilt that heavy eventually breaks. And when he did, Patricia's whole kingdom of dread would break with him. The hospital smell clung to me long after I left, antiseptic and unease, a reminder of my wife's shallow breaths and the wires that tethered her to stability. I walked into our driveway at dawn, exhausted but burning inside, only to find the envelope already taped to our front door. Patricia's latest decree. I tore it free, the paper rattling in my hand, and read the bold black words. Final warning. Property line pending. Her timing was perfect, cruel and calculated. My wife was still in a hospital bed, and the HOA queen was already trying to put a lien on the roof over our heads. She wasn't satisfied with bruises and panic. She wanted blood in the form of property, cash, control, and she wanted it fast. I stepped inside, the violation letter crumpled in my fist. The house smelled faintly of coffee grounds from the pot I'd left burning yesterday, stale and bitter, matching the taste in my mouth. I laid the letter flat on the counter, smoothing the wrinkles as my jaw clenched. Unauthorized flowers, barbecue noise, parking under the oak tree. Now this. Patricia wasn't enforcing order. She was escalating war. The phone rang. I knew before I answered who it was. "This is the board office," the voice said, flat, rehearsed, smug. "Failure to comply will result in immediate action, including foreclosure proceedings." Foreclosure. They weren't just threatening fines anymore. The tyrant in heels was coming for our home, for my wife's stability, for the nursery we'd painted yellow, the room where we'd hung the first baby clothes. My grip on the receiver tightened. My voice came out low, calm, edged with steel. "Tell Patricia this isn't over." I hung up before they could respond. Outside, I heard the faint crackle of voices. Curtains shifted in windows. A few residents lingered on lawns, eyes darting away when I looked at them. The whole street felt wired, tense, like Patricia had already spread her version of the story. That's how she worked, public shame before private guilt. I marched to the HOA office, letter in hand. The glass doors reflected my hollow eyes, but I pushed through, the sharp scent of disinfectant mixing with perfume. Patricia sat behind the counter, not even pretending anymore. She leaned back in her chair, fingers laced, queen of her fiefdom. "Michael Torres," she said, savoring the syllables like poison candy. "I warned you. Your wife's behavior yesterday, reckless, dangerous. The board can't tolerate liabilities like that." My stomach flipped, rage like fire licking up my spine. "She's 8 months pregnant," I shot back. "Your guard assaulted her." Patricia tilted her head, her bob glinting under the lights. "That's not how witnesses will see it. Family said she was aggressive, uncooperative." She smiled thinly. "Perception is everything." Behind her, I caught sight of Thomas Reed's wife, small frame, quiet presence, filing papers in the back. Her eyes flicked up, wide and nervous, then down again quickly. Even here, fear worked like cement. Patricia slid another document across the counter. "Sign it, Michael. Admit fault, pay the fines, and we'll forget about foreclosure. Otherwise—" She let the word dangle, her nails tapping rhythm on the wood. The temptation to rip the paper in half pulsed through me, but I didn't touch it. Instead, I leaned forward until my reflection stared back at me in her polished desk. "Escalate then. Just remember, the higher the climb, the harder the fall." Her smile faltered for just a second, a hairline crack in the facade, but she recovered fast. "You think you're clever, but you're just one man." One man with a skill set she didn't understand. One man who knew that unlicensed guards and illegal liens were more fragile than they looked. One man who wasn't about to bow. I walked out, the community's eyes tracking me as the door hissed shut behind me. My hands shook, not with dread, but with decision. Patricia had drawn her line into permanent marker. She thought the law bent to her clipboard. But I knew better. The law has teeth, and she just shoved her hand straight into its mouth. The oak tree's branches swayed in the breeze as I passed, leaves whispering like witnesses. My wife's words echoed in my head. "Don't let them win." I clenched my fists. No more waiting. Patricia had turned this into war, and wars are won with precision. My precision. I left the HOA office with Patricia Moore's smirk carved into my mind, the threat of foreclosure still ringing in my ears. The morning sun was sharp, almost mocking, as if the world dared me to break under her weight. But breaking isn't in my blueprint. I drove straight to my office downtown, where the walls smell like ink and metal, where blueprints cover the desks, and where codes aren't just guidelines. They're the law carved into concrete. I dropped the violation notice on my drafting table, the words, "Property Lion Pending," staring back at me like a dare. My computer hummed to life, and I pulled up the county code database. If the board president thought she could choke us with paperwork, she'd forgotten that I lived in the language of compliance. She spoke threats. I spoke law. I replayed the slam in my mind, my wife's body folding, the thug's hand pressing the door with intent, his face smug like he was above consequence. But the detail that snapped into focus wasn't his action. It was his uniform, cheap fabric, no badge number, no county seal, just a patch that read "Security," stitched on with threads already fraying at the edges. My fingers flew over the keyboard. I cross-referenced county records, private security firm licensing, guard rosters, nothing. No registered officer by his description. No licensed personnel assigned to Willow Creek Estates. My pulse spiked. Patricia's muscle had no legal authority to touch anyone, let alone assault a pregnant woman. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as the realization solidified. Patricia hadn't just broken moral ground. She'd broken the law, and not a minor infraction, a breach that opened her board to criminal liability. This wasn't about violations anymore. This was about assault, fraud, negligence, and the county's own licensing department ready to sink their teeth in. I printed the records, the machine spitting them out with mechanical finality. The smell of toner mixed with my coffee, bitter and sharp, and for the first time in days, A smile cut across my face. Patricia thought she'd cornered me, but she'd just handed me the weapon I needed. I remembered Emily's voice at the hospital, weak but steady. Don't let them win. My hand pressed against the stack of documents. I won't, I whispered to the empty room. The phone buzzed on my desk. Another message from the HOA, this time a notice of emergency board hearing scheduled for the weekend. Of course. The tyrant in heels wanted a stage, a chance to parade her version of the story before the community, to bury us under her narrative before the truth surfaced. She didn't know I already had the match that could burn her down. I grabbed my jacket, the papers tucked under my arm, and stepped outside. The city air hit me, horns blaring, construction clattering, but it felt different now. The chaos was mine to control. My career had been built on exposing hidden weaknesses, the kind that turned towers into rubble when ignored. And Patricia Moore? She was nothing but a tower of arrogance built on sand. At a crosswalk, I spotted a newspaper stand. The headline screamed about a corporate scandal, an unlicensed contractor exposed after cutting corners. I laughed under my breath. History repeats itself. And soon, Patricia would be another headline. I headed back toward Willow Creek, past the manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges that masked the rot underneath. Every SUV and every driveway looked polished, but behind each curtain were families afraid of fines, liens, and threats. Terror kept them silent, but dread cracks when truth gets loud enough. The oak tree came into view as I turned the corner. Its branches stretched wide, defiant against the blue sky. Emily's laughter echoed in my memory, the way she'd rested her head against its bark when she told me she was pregnant. That tree had been witness to our joy, and now it would be witness to Patricia's downfall. I parked, the papers still clutched in my hand, my heartbeat sinking with the thrum of possibility. Patricia thought her guard was muscle. What she didn't know was that he was the beginning of her collapse. Because now, I had more than rage. I had proof. And proof has power no board can erase. The case file sat heavy in my briefcase like a loaded weapon, but no weight compared to the silence in Emily's hospital room. Machines ticked out her heartbeat, monitors blinking, each pulse a reminder of how close the HOA president had pushed us to the edge. I stood at her bedside, staring at the curve of her stomach, the rise and fall of her chest. She looked small beneath the white sheets, fragile in a way she never had before. The doctor entered quietly, a chart in hand, glasses low on his nose. "She's stable," he said, voice even, but laced with warning. "But stress like this, sudden trauma, puts both her and the baby at risk. If it happens again, if she takes another blow like that..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. My throat closed, rage rising like acid. Patricia hadn't just trespassed on our property. She'd trespassed on our future. She'd turned our unborn child into a pawn in her power games. I pressed my hand against my wife's, her fingers curling weakly around mine. Her eyes opened, heavy-lidded, but clear enough. "Mike," she whispered, voice thin as paper, "you can't let her win." "I won't," I said, steady even though my chest felt like it would cave. Inside, I wanted to scream, to rip her empire apart with my bare hands. But raw anger wouldn't save Emily. Precision would. The hallway outside was quiet, fluorescent lights humming. I leaned against the wall, head bowed, the doctor's words repeating in my mind. One more strike, and I could lose everything. My wife, my daughter, the oak tree memories we'd built into our lives. That was the line. The point of no return. My phone buzzed with another email from the HOA board. Immediate compliance required. A photo attachment showed our front yard with a trash can left at the curb 2 hours past collection time. They called it evidence of disorder. My hands shook as I stared at the photo. Emily was fighting for her life, and Patricia was still firing shots from her throne. I stepped outside, the evening air cool against my burning skin. The parking lot smelled faintly of exhaust, the asphalt radiating leftover heat. I pulled out the dossier I'd uncovered, proof the enforcer was unlicensed, proof Patricia had overstepped not just morally, but legally. I stared at the pages under the fading light. They weren't just paper, they were lifelines. They were the foundation for striking back. Thomas Reed's voice echoed in my head. She'll bury me if I testify. He wasn't wrong. Patricia buried people in liens, fines, whispers of non-compliance. But intimidation can't last forever. It cracks under the weight of truth, and truth was exactly what I had. I tightened my grip on the folder. Emily's life was more than memory. It was future. The HOA queen wanted me broken, on my knees, begging to sign her papers. But that wasn't going to happen. Not now, not ever. I looked up at the sky, dark clouds rolling in, the first hint of a storm. It felt fitting. Patricia had turned this into war, and storms don't wait for permission. I shoved the evidence folder back into my briefcase, my jaw set. Emily needed rest. The baby needed peace. But what they needed most was for me to dismantle Patricia before she struck again. And I knew exactly where to start. County licensing, the sheriff's office, the places where truth still had power, sharp enough to cut through her lies. I returned to her bedside, kissed her forehead, and whispered so low only she could hear, "I promise, I'll end this." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, exhaustion pulling her back under. I pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, my chest heavy but resolute. The fight wasn't optional anymore. It was survival. The storm broke the next morning, rain hammering the roof of my house in a rhythm that sounded like war drums. Emily was still in the hospital, stable but fragile, her body carrying the weight of Patricia Moore's cruelty. I stood at the window, watching water streak down the glass, when I heard the knock. Sharp, hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened the door, and there stood Thomas Reed. His hood was pulled up, his jacket soaked. But what struck me wasn't the rain dripping from his shoulders. It was the storm in his eyes. He stepped inside without asking, shaking off water, his fists clenched like he'd been holding them tight all night. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He paced across my living room, his boots leaving wet prints on the hardwood. His body betrayed him, every muscle twitching, his jaw grinding, his hands wringing together as if he was trying to squeeze courage out of bone. Finally, he stopped, shoulders heaving, and looked at me with the expression of a man cornered by his own conscience. "I heard her," he said, voice hoarse. The words cracked the silence like lightning. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Thomas dragged a hand over his face, water dripping from his hair. "After the slam, after your wife screamed." Patricia looked at that guard and said, "Good, now they'll learn." His chest rose sharply. She wanted it, she ordered it. The words hit me harder than any blow. The tyrant in heels hadn't just allowed the assault. She'd celebrated it. Thomas's hands trembled. He gripped the back of a chair like it was the only thing holding him up. His voice cracked as he continued. "I should have stepped in. God, I should have. But I froze. My wife, she begged me not to get involved. Said Patricia would bleed us dry with fines if I so much as raised a word. And she's right. Patricia's destroyed people for less." He swallowed hard, eyes darting around the room like she might be hiding in the walls. "But I can't carry it anymore." His words rushed out, fast, broken. "I see her face every time I close. My eyes. I hear your wife scream in my ears. And I can't live with it. Not if I stay quiet." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Thomas, what you're saying, if you put it on record, it changes everything." He nodded, though his body resisted the truth his mind had accepted. His shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of dread, his breathing shallow. "She'll come for me. You know she will. She'll hit me with violations until I'm broke. But maybe it's worth it." He met my eyes then, and for the first time, I saw the firefighter who used to run into flames. His fear was real, but beneath it burned something stronger. Resolve. I put a hand on his shoulder. "It is worth it. You saw what she did. You heard her order it. That testimony isn't just words, Thomas. It's the crack that brings her whole empire down." His throat worked as he swallowed, his eyes glassy. "Then I'll say it. I'll tell them what I saw, what I heard, no more silence." Relief surged through me, sharp and overwhelming. I'd carried the weight of this fight alone, but now, for the first time, I had an ally, not just proof on paper, living testimony, a voice to echo mine when Patricia tried to drown me out. The storm rolled over Willow Creek like an omen, thunder rattling the windows as Thomas's words replayed in my head. She wanted it. She ordered it. Patricia had crossed the line from arrogance into criminal intent. And now I had more than rage. I had proof. My wife's faint voice at the hospital still anchored me. Don't let them win. That promise burned in my chest as I spread the evidence across my desk. Medical reports documenting Emily's trauma. The county records showing the thug wasn't licensed. The stack of violation notices Patricia had used like a whip. And now, Thomas Reed's testimony, an eyewitness account that she'd ordered the assault. Each piece was a blade. Together, they were an arsenal. I pinned the documents onto my corkboard, the rain outside hammering like a drumline. The room smelled of damp paper and black coffee, the kind of scent that clings to sleepless nights. I traced the lines with my finger, connecting the dots. Patricia thought she'd buried me under paperwork, but all she'd really done was leave a trail of evidence straight to her own downfall. Strategy wasn't new to me. I've stood over blueprints that decided whether skyscrapers stood tall or fell like dominoes. Precision under pressure was my survival. And Patricia? She'd built her kingdom on weak joints, fear, intimidation, unlicensed guards. I knew exactly where to strike. First, the sheriff's office. Assault wasn't a violation. It was a crime. With Thomas willing to testify and Emily's medical records in hand, they'd have grounds to act. Second, the county licensing department. An unlicensed enforcer meant fines, shutdowns, criminal liability. Patricia's board hadn't just bent the law. They'd snapped it. Third, the court of public opinion. Residents were scared, but intimidation shifts fast when one person stands tall. If they saw me fight, if they saw Patricia exposed, they'd rally. Silence only survives until courage speaks louder. I poured all of it into a dossier, each page encased in plastic sleeves. Every detail mattered, every date, every signature, every violation stamped with Patricia's name. She loved her authority on paper. Now, it would be paper that destroyed her. Lightning flashed outside, and in the glow, I saw Emily's photo on the mantel, her hand resting on her belly, smiling beneath the oak tree. The sight twisted something inside me. That tree wasn't just wood and roots. It was legacy. And Patricia had tried to poison it with terror. If you've ever turned pain into power, hit like right now, because this is where the tables flip. The front door creaked open, and Thomas stepped in again, soaked from the storm, eyes red from sleeplessness. He saw the evidence folder on the desk, the documents lined like ammunition. "You're really doing this," he muttered, half in awe, half in fear. "I'm not just doing it," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm finishing it." He walked closer, shoulders stiff. His hands hovered over the pages, trembling as if even touching them would paint a target on his back. "Once this starts, there's no undoing it." I nodded. "That's the point." Thomas exhaled hard, then finally let his hands drop onto the table. His fingers pressed against the page with Patricia's signature. His jaw tightened. Then I'm in. The room shifted, the storm outside sinking with the storm inside us. For the first time, I wasn't alone in the fight. Two men who refused to bow, two men carrying the weight of silence breaking. I slipped the case file into my briefcase, snapped it shut, and slung it over my shoulder. My reflection in the rain-streaked window didn't look broken anymore. It looked ready. Patricia had thrown everything she had at me: fines, liens, threats, violence. But now, I had everything I needed to dismantle her throne. The storm raged on, but inside, clarity cut through. This wasn't just a plan, it was precision. And Patricia Moore was about to learn that when you build on intimidation, you build on sand, and sand collapses. The next morning, I walked into the community center meeting room with the evidence folder heavy at my side, rain still clinging to the windows. Rectangular tables were pushed together, fluorescent lights humming, coffee in the corner. I set the dossier down and felt the pages settle like a gauntlet. Residents came in, faces I knew from lawns, others who'd filmed then hidden their phones. Their eyes were raw. I didn't waste time, no small talk. I laid the hospital chart on the table, then the county records proving Patricia's enforcer had no authority. Faces changed, politeness peeled away into anger, then a tremor of hope. "She'll bury us in fines," someone muttered. I met the dread and cut it off. She'll try, but we have evidence, witnesses, and law. We drew a plan on a whiteboard, 3 moves. 1. Simultaneous complaints to the sheriff and county licensing so the inquiry couldn't be stalled by local spin. 2. A coordinated press tip to a reporter I'd lined up. 3. A visible presence at the HOA hearing so the tyrant in heels couldn't stage an empty theater. Alone, those moves might be shrugged off. Together, they'd squeeze every seam. Thomas sat with his hands curled, knuckles white. He'd walked through flames and still feared Patricia's reach. If I testify, he said, voice tight, she'll make me an example. I told him how we'd protect him. Statements filed at once. Officers present when he spoke. His shoulders dropped a fraction. I'll do it, he said. It was the hinge, vulnerability swinging toward courage. We parceled roles. Mrs. Alvarez would gather signatures and neighbor statements. Mr. Chen would stream the hearing live. The Martinez family would canvass doors. Teenagers volunteered to timestamp clips. The arsenal became a toolkit. Photographs, medical notes, timestamps, witness names, licensing printouts, and a schedule. I filed the formal complaint at the sheriff's office that afternoon. The deputy took my statement with a seriousness I hadn't expected. They logged it and promised an inquiry. That stamp felt like air after being underwater. We scheduled the licensing complaint to be filed the same hour. The reporter I'd contacted arrived at the community center that evening with a notepad and a steady stare. I handed him the case file and an audio clip of the thug bragging in a bar. He promised to follow the sheriff's lead and report if the investigation moved forward. Media attention would deny the board privacy to rewrite the story. We set traps. Residents were instructed to record security patrols, note license plates, and timestamps. We filed a records request demanding the HOA produce contracts and invoices by a deadline. If Patricia produced nothing, silence would be revealing. If she produced forged invoices, that would open another criminal layer. There were ugly risks. I told everyone bluntly. Expect retaliation. Fines, threats, personal attacks. Some backed away, others stayed. The ones who stayed agreed to quiet coordination. No grandstanding, only synchronized filings and presence. By dusk, the meeting room buzzed quietly, names and numbers pinned to a board. Thomas held a stack of witness statements, thumb on the edge like a man feeling a burden lift. Mrs. Alvarez handed me a printout, a neighbor's recording of the guard bragging. I slipped it into a sleeve and felt something shift. I locked eyes with each person and felt a line form between us, a lineup of ordinary people ready to act. The crowd outside had been subdued too long. Now it was ready to push. As all people left, small groups clustered under the awning, voices low but determined. The oak's shadow stretched across the parking lot. I packed the dossier, its pages rustling like armor, and felt the first real steadiness return. The sheriff had our complaint. The reporter had a lead. Residents had roles. The traps were set. Thomas walked beside me to our cars, rain streaking his face. He looked at me and said, "Maybe after this people won't be so afraid." He sounded almost hopeful. I nodded. "They won't. We just made the weather." The night before the HOA hearing, I spread everything across my dining room table. Photographs, witness statements, timestamps, until the wood was buried under proof. The rain had passed, leaving the air damp and heavy, like a calm before detonation. My case file sat at the center, its sleeves reflecting the lamp. Inside, the unlicensed enforcer records, the medical report, Thomas's signed account, and the residents' signed complaints. Each page a blade honed for the strike. I slid the last sheet into place and snapped the dossier shut. The sound echoed in the house like a verdict. Tomorrow wasn't just another HOA meeting. It was the stage where the HOA queen thought she'd humiliate me. But she had no idea I was bringing the sheriff, the licensing department, and the weight of a community that had finally decided silence wasn't survival anymore. Thomas called that night. His voice still shook, but his words were steady. "I'll be there. No backing down." It wasn't just commitment. It was a man pulling himself out of the fire he'd been trapped in. For the first time, his hesitation sounded smaller than his resolve. At dawn, I dressed like it was war: dark jacket, polished shoes, the dossier in one hand, coffee in the other. The air outside was cool, the oak tree's roots dark and strong. I paused beneath it, running my hand over the bark. A hospital bracelet still lay in my pocket. Emily's, a small circle of plastic that had become a symbol of why this mattered. Patricia had tried to turn our yard into a crime scene. Tomorrow, that spot would be the symbol of her downfall. Residents gathered quietly as the sun rose. Mrs. Alvarez handed me a petition with more signatures than I expected. Mr. Chen tested his phone camera, preparing to stream. Teenagers whispered about which clips to post first. Unease was still there, but it was cracking. You could see it in the way people stood closer together, in the way eyes that once looked down now looked forward. The hearing was set for the evening, but preparation didn't stop. I filed the last of the complaints with the county licensing office, walking in with the dossier under my arm. The clerk raised her brows at the stack I dropped on the counter. Unlicensed security, I said. Used to assault a resident. Documented, witnessed, corroborated. Her pen scratched across the intake sheet. This will escalate quickly, she muttered. That was the point. Next was the sheriff's office. I delivered the hospital report, Thomas's signed testimony, and the audio clip of the thug bragging. The deputy nodded, eyes serious. We'll be present at the meeting, he said flatly. Just like that, the final piece slid into place. Patricia expected theater. I was setting up her arrest. By afternoon, the neighborhood buzzed like sparking wires. Word spread faster than fines. People peeked out their windows, whispered on porches, gathered under umbrellas. The tyrant in heels wanted fear to keep them silent. Instead, dread turned into anticipation. That night, I sat in the quiet of my house, dossier on the table, phone buzzing with messages confirming attendance. The mother of my child called from the hospital, her voice soft but fierce. Be careful, she said, but don't stop. I won't, I promised. I stared at the oak through the window, its branches a dark silhouette. Tomorrow, the board president would walk into the hall certain of her power. She'd smile that same smug smile. But when the sheriff stepped through the doors, when licensing officials announced violations, when Thomas stood and told the truth, her smile would crack. And once it cracked, it would never come back. I closed my eyes and pictured it. Neighbors in the room, the board's nervous glances, Patricia's heels clicking against the tile as she strutted in, blind to the noose tightening around her. Every piece aligned, every trap laid. Tomorrow wasn't just a hearing, it was judgment. The boardroom smelled of polish and perfume, the kind of stage cleanliness the HOA queen loved to weaponize. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of folding chairs, residents shifting uneasily as if they already sensed this wasn't a routine humiliation. At the front, the board table gleamed, microphones set like little thrones. Then the click of heels announced her arrival. Patricia Moore entered in a crimson blazer, her smile sharp as glass, chin high. She carried no files. She didn't need them, at least not in her mind. Her presence had always been her weapon. She scanned the room, lips curling when her eyes landed on me. To her, this was theater. She didn't know I'd already rewritten the script. On the walls, people stood, phones ready, whispers cutting through the stale air. Thomas sat in the second row, jaw tight, fists clenched. His anxiety still clung to him, but tonight it braided with resolve. Mrs. Alvarez clutched the petition. Mr. Chen's phone streamed live. This wasn't just another HOA meeting. It was an audience the tyrant in heels couldn't silence. She sat, smoothed her blazer, and tapped the microphone. This hearing addresses repeated violations by Michael Torres and his family, she declared, smug. They've disrupted community standards, endangered safety, and failed to comply with board orders. The words barely left her mouth before the sheriff stepped through the doors. Two deputies, uniforms crisp, faces unreadable, stationed themselves at the back. Gasps rippled through the room. Patricia's smile faltered for the first time. I stood, dossier in hand, and walked to the front. My footsteps echoed. I laid the evidence folder on the board table, the plastic sleeves catching the light. Before we discuss flowers and trash cans, I said evenly, let's discuss criminal liability. Murmurs surged. The HOA president's eyes narrowed, her hands tightening on the arms of her chair. "This is highly irregular," she began. I opened the folder, flipped the first page, and slid the hospital report into the microphone's spotlight. "My wife," I said, voice steady, "is in the hospital because your unlicensed enforcer slammed a car door into her pregnant stomach. Here's the medical documentation." Phone zoomed in, gasps erupted. Patricia tried to cut me off, but I spoke louder, clearer. "Here's the county record showing no license for that security, no authority to touch anyone, and here's sworn testimony from a firefighter who heard you order it." All eyes turned to Thomas. He stood slowly, knees trembling, but his voice, though shaky, cut through the room. "I heard her. She told the guard, 'Good. Now they'll learn.'" The room erupted. Residents shouted, phones lifted higher. Patricia's face blanched, then flushed red. She slammed her palm on the table. "Lies! Fabrications!" she snapped. A deputy stepped forward, voice calm but final. "We'll take it from here, ma'am. You'll need to come with us." Her chair screeched as she shot to her feet, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "You think you've won? You're nothing. You'll regret this." Her words cut off as a hand touched her shoulder. The sight froze the room. Patricia Moore, queen of fines, escorted away under the weight of her own arrogance. Residents who once cowered now cheered. Their voices rose above the hum of lights. Phones captured every second, the live stream pouring truth beyond the room. As the deputies led her away, she twisted back toward me, eyes burning with fury. But her power was gone. The community saw it. It felt different. The oak outside wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a promise kept. Patricia's empire had collapsed under the weight of evidence. The boardroom emptied slowly, like a battlefield after the smoke clears. Chairs scraped, voices rose and fell. Residents lingering, no longer whispering in fear, but buzzing with relief. Possibility eased across their faces. The weight Patricia had pressed on this community for years was gone, ripped away in a single night. I stood near the front, the dossier still on the table, though I no longer needed it. Deputies had walked Patricia out in handcuffs, her crimson blazer crumpled, heels clicking a hollow rhythm down the hall. She spat threats as they passed the oak, but the words had no bite. Power only works when people believe it. Tonight, no one did. Thomas Reed stepped up beside me, shoulders finally straight. The dread that once bent him into silence had cracked. He extended his hand. When I shook it, his grip was firm, steady. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, voice thick, "but I'm glad I did now." He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was free. Mrs. Alvarez passed me the petition, signatures sprawling across the pages. "You're not alone," she said simply. Behind her, Mr. Chen ended the live stream, already receiving messages from neighbors across the city. Word spread fast. Patricia Moore wouldn't just be a name on our block. She'd be a cautionary tale. I stepped outside into cool night air. The storm had passed, leaving streets slick, streetlights reflecting off puddles. The oak stood silent, strong, branches dripping. I placed a hand against the bark, rough and unyielding, and thought of the mother of my child, her laughter, the pain Patricia tried to carve into our lives, the legacy it still held. My phone buzzed. Emily called from the hospital. Her voice was tired, but warm. "How did it go?" she asked. "She's gone," I said. "The board will face investigations. And you," my voice caught, "you can rest knowing she won't touch us again." A soft laugh, broken but beautiful. "Good," she whispered. "Our daughter deserves better than fear." I stood beneath the oak, phone pressed to my ear, and let the moment sink in. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about every family who'd hidden behind curtains, every resident who'd paid fines in silence, every person who thought they couldn't fight back. Tonight proved otherwise. Patricia's reign ended because one man refused to bow, and because intimidation cracks when truth is louder. If you want more powerful stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe now, share your story in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. This fight isn't just mine. It's yours too. I slid the evidence folder under my arm and walked back toward the hospital, the night air cool, the road ahead clear. Patricia was in a cell. My wife was safe. The oak stood tall, bearing witness to a promise kept. Justice wasn't theory anymore. It was alive, rooted, undeniable.